Moral value between humans and animals: a question of ethics. So, for this presentation, I'm going to ask of you to perform this thought experiment. Imagine a dangerous situation like a hurricane, a flood, or an earthquake, or whatever, in which you are in a position to save one out of two living beings. One, a complete stranger who is a human being that you have never seen before in your life, and two, your beloved pet, whether it is your dog or your cat or any other pet that you have a very strong emotional attachment to. Now, I'm going to pose a more difficult question. Why? What is your reasoning behind your response? Why would you choose the stranger over your pet, or vice versa? Well, usually when I ask people these questions, they answer in terms of value. So, in order to determine who we would save, we have to first determine the value of a living being. Now, when I ask different people, these questions about moral value, they usually answer. Their answers can be separated into two separate categories. One, answers that are determined by emotional value, and two, answers that are determined by intelligence. Now, these methods can be traced back to two different philosophies: the utilitarian philosophy and the ethics of care philosophy. Now, the ethics of care philosophy is an ethical theory that holds interpersonal relationships and care or benevolence as a virtue as central to moral actions. So basically, what this means is that what determines the value of a living being is your relationship to said living being. So, in order to answer the question of the thought experiment, a person who follows the ethics of care philosophy would propose this argument, which has four premises. One, my emotional attachment to my pet is much greater than that of the stranger. Two, it would pain me a lot if I were to let my pet die. Three, it wouldn't pay me nearly as much if I were to let the stranger die. Four, therefore I should let the stranger die and save my pet. The utilitarian philosophy is the doctrine that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. So basically what it means is that the whether or not an action is moral is if it caused more happiness than suffering. Now, in order to continue with the utilitarian philosophy, we have to go back to the method of intelligence that we use to determine the value of a living species. Of a living being. First of all, a human being is more intelligent than a pet, no offense. And because the human being is more intelligent than the pet, the human being can experience suffering on a larger scale than animals. And that's the first premise. The second premise is that because of the first premise, it would cause more suffering if I were to let the stranger die than if I were to let my pet die, because the human experiences suffering on a much larger scale. Therefore, I would save the stranger and let my pet die, because it would cause more happiness than suffering, or at least minimize the amount of suffering as much as possible. Now, in my opinion, there are many problems with determining the value of a living being using ethics of care. First of the many problems is that the ethics of care philosophy is subjective, because it relies on emotional attachments and relationships to living beings, and that determines their value. And because of that, it justifies sacrificing any number of people slash animals instead of just one beloved person slash animal. Because in ethics care, what really matters is your relationship to said person slash animal, not necessarily the amount of suffering caused by an action founded on that philosophy. And because of that, it usually causes more suffering than happiness, except in cases where the result of a decision used, um, except in cases in which the result of the decision in which the person used the ethics of care philosophy coincidentally aligned with the utilitarian philosophy. And in my opinion, the many benefits of determining value using utilitarianism is that utilitarianism is objective and it is rational, and it is also designed for the purpose to create as much happiness for as many people as possible. Now, the reason why it's subjective is because it uses intelligence, which is a measurable way to determine the value of a living being. And also because it is a biological fact that humans experience suffering and happiness on a much larger scale than animals. And also because it values the suffering of unfamiliar people slash animals. So basically, it doesn't matter what your relationship is with that person or animal, they all are equally as valuable, de- depending on the species. Now, yes, this is my opinion on the thought experiment, which is that the utilitarian approach is better, and that according to the utilitarian approach, we should value the stranger more than the pet, even though the pet in that thought experiment unfortunately will die. You will have caused more happiness than suffering in saving the stranger, because not only the stranger's happiness is on a much larger scale than the animals, but also the happiness and suffering of the family members of the stranger, as well as his or her friends and people who were close to him or her. So, yes, that is my presentation, and that's it. Thank you for watching.